The global supply chain disruption has affected all sectors, particularly because of a reliance on semiconductors, an essential component of electronic devices used in countless applications across industries, including the phone or computer that you're probably using right now. In today's episode, which is the third and final part of a series about global supply chains, we dig into the cause and effect of this particular shortage and how companies are adapting as a result. My name is Neuberger, and to help me navigate this topic, I've been joined by Daniel Flax, Senior Research Analyst for the Technology Sector at Neuberger Berman, to share his perspectives on this key piece of the complex supply chain puzzle. Dan, thanks so much for joining me today and for returning to the show.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Anu.
For those listeners who aren't aware, Dan was on one of our very first episodes of the show where he was discussing 5G and technology for the future. So almost 2 years past that episode, Dan's back on really to talk about semiconductor shortages. So Dan, of course, headlines have been talking about these shortages for a long time. But just in case our listeners have missed out on any of those key developments, can you give us a quick rundown of what's been going on with semiconductors over the last couple of years and what are you seeing today?
Throughout COVID, Anu, what we've seen is that different industries have responded to the crisis, the pandemic, the recession differently. So, for example, if you look at the automobile industry, when COVID and the recession hit, those companies cut back on their production. And so that rippled through the supply chain and they didn't have the need for as many semiconductors, or so they thought. Whereas if you look at other industries, for example, the technology industry itself, laptops, tablets, all the devices, the video, the audio, everything that we now are using even more than we used prior to COVID, the demand for that has been extraordinary. And so you've had a mismatch in terms of supply and demand across industries. And the result is that the supply chain has been working around the clock to be able to make adjustments. And ultimately, we expect all these supply challenges to get worked out over the next couple of years, but it's going to be a very dynamic period while we continue to work through everything.
Thanks so much, Dan. So, exponential demand and probably, similar amount of supply as before and potential shortages. So with that in mind, Dan, tell us about how companies adapted to those shortages and what's the end in sight for consumers here?
I think for consumers, we're in a place where the technology, the power, the magic of the devices and the services has never been greater. And as we think about the world ahead, we can see augmented, virtual reality, the metaverse becoming more and more important to what we do. But as businesses, there's severe dislocations. There are, in some cases, very specific components that are not made in sufficient quantities. And so an entire product could be a car in some cases that is being held up as a result of that. So what we're seeing is that some companies are redesigning or making changes to the products and what components they use in order to be able to get the product out to market, even though they don't have everything that they would have used in the past. So you're seeing a level of redesign. You're seeing companies use this opportunity, given the disruption everywhere, to rethink how they approach products for both businesses and consumers. And so a lot of change. I think what resonates and what we find with the discussions with all of our companies is this notion of flexibility, creativity, really thinking about things very, very differently than we have in the past.
Sure. And on that note, Dan, you mentioned redesigning, adapting, new products, creativity. Is there a company that you particularly have admired in terms of how it may have evolved over the last couple of years?
If you look at some of what the technology companies have done, and I'll use Apple, which many of the listeners will know what they make, but the fact that they've been able to design, test, bring products and services, but products in particular, out to market in the face of extreme challenges to the supply chain, which is global for a company like Apple, that's been extraordinary in many respects. And I think this ability to innovate, to collaborate internally in terms of their teams, working together with their suppliers, with really the whole supply chain to bring new products to market in an environment where, of course, all of us need new technology, that's been extraordinary. They're certainly not the only ones, but I mention them because of their size, of their scale, and the importance in many of the products that a lot of us use every day.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Now, Dan, I want to pivot a little bit to talk about the infrastructure component of this supply chain crisis. And I'm using the term infrastructure quite broadly here, but tell us about what technology companies are doing to really bolster their corporate infrastructure in addition to their digital infrastructure.
One of the most interesting things about this period is that a lot of the companies, and certainly we'll focus on the technology companies, they haven't really missed a beat in terms of how they operate. Now, clearly, a lot of it has moved to the digital world, but if we look in the physical world, there has been investments announced and underway in the tens, really the hundreds of billions of dollars. So you look at a company like Intel, for example, announcing big multi-year investments in the state of Arizona, more recently in Ohio. You look at Taiwan Semiconductor, you look at Samsung, you look at these innovative companies that are looking to expand their footprints, their manufacturing presence in the United States, in Europe, really globally, because when we think about how the world looks on the other side of all of this, it's clear that technology will have a more and more important role to play. And so, sure, we're going to have cycles, but the ability to add capacity and bring semiconductors, in this case, to all of these other industries that really need them for that next wave of innovation. That's what's going on the ground. And I think when we do our podcasts in 3 or 4 years from now, that will still be underway because this is a multi-year journey.
Sure. And it sounds like expansion has been the name of the game more so than, nearshoring or onshoring. Is that true? Or what are you seeing?
It's a combination. These companies are all global, and many of them have operated in multiple regions for decades. I think clearly there's an element of nearshoring in some cases. So, for example, here in the United States, the percentage of semiconductor manufacturing has gone down as it has grown in Asia. And I think certainly the United States Congress and the companies are looking to increase the semiconductor manufacturing here. And that's because their customers are looking to have more of that local supply. We've seen some of the challenges with logistics, with trade. And so many companies here in the United States, certainly in Europe as well, are appreciating that the need to have more local supply is important. I would underscore, though, these companies remain global in nature. They're drawing on talent in geographies and regions all over the world. So still global, but certainly a lot more local manufacturing, I think, in the decades ahead.
Yeah, that's great. And, I did want to ask just to expand on those comments just about geopolitics within technology. This was something that we talked a little bit about with Marco Spinar in the second episode of the series. And, Marco covers the emerging markets. But wanted to ask you, what are some of the key geopolitical issues that have come up over the last couple of years, and how do you see those evolving going forward?
The trade tension with China, which has been underway for several years, remains a dynamic that all companies are navigating. We've seen that certainly with 5G in terms of the bifurcation of supply chains in certain respects. That's likely to be a factor over the coming years. I think, though, a lot of what both China and some economies in the West are looking to do is really ensure that a lot of intellectual property, a lot of talent, a lot of resource is in their geography or close by so they can access it, because everyone is appreciating 5G or the next generation of connectivity, among other things, is really foundational to the whole wave of innovation that lies ahead. And as we're also seeing, their implications in terms of the economies, but societies more broadly are being impacted by technology, how it's used, how communication takes place, how people transact, how healthcare services are being delivered. And so really it's touching all aspects of our lives. And that trend is likely to only accelerate in the next several years.
Excellent. Thank you. Dan, I wanted you to see if you could speak a little bit about, as we move from the pandemic becoming an endemic, what are the other key risks that you see on the horizon for the technology sector? And then if you could follow that, I would also like to hear about where you think the biggest opportunities are, particularly coming out of the supply chain. So risks as well as opportunities, if you don't mind.
The risks are numerous, Anu, and I'd highlight a few. So first, the technology risk around many of these companies, and I'll give you some examples, is extraordinary. Most of these companies have not been able to make it through from one cycle to the next. I'll mention Microsoft. We talked about Intel. These two companies are ones that have been able to grow and transform themselves over decades, but that's been very hard to do. And so the technology risk itself remains high. Another big challenge that the industry has been facing has been issues around trade and the bifurcation of supply chains. And so I do think that's one that the companies, the industries, and frankly, even the governments are going to be able to sort out over the next several years. But that does remain a risk from day to day as companies struggle to find the right components. If I step back and think about the opportunities, I'll start with the cloud and this build out of the digital infrastructure, which of course requires physical investments, as we've talked about in terms of manufacturing plants, servers, chips. There's software, of course, that is so important in making sure things work properly. And so this build out of the cloud, think about Amazon Web Services, think about Microsoft Azure, think about the Google Cloud Platform. As big as those companies are becoming, in many ways, this trend, this build out of the cloud is still in the very early innings. Another important change or development that we see is that artificial intelligence, or AI, which in some respects has been with us for quite some time, we're now entering an era where there is virtually unlimited compute and analytics horsepower that can be applied. Think about using AI for drug discovery. Think about using it for fraud detection. Think about using it for modeling for climate change. And so trends like artificial intelligence, which have been with us for some time, are really entering a new era because of the enormous capabilities and solutions from companies like an NVIDIA that they're able to bring to market. I'll also mention the metaverse, which gets a lot of attention. We've been focused on augmented and virtual reality and the infusion of digital content into the physical world for some time. And what we're beginning to see from a device perspective, and it remains early, is that you really can come up with experiences on a smartphone, I'm sure with better and better glasses or visors over time that people use that really are able to transform the experience. So that's transformational. We've talked about 5G, but what I would suggest is that when we think about how the automobile industry, all of these industries that might touch it, for example, robotics, drones, think about all things that move around or fly around, the ability to infuse it with intelligence, with semiconductor content, with software, and really transform how those platforms evolve. That's pretty significant. And I'll round it out with, as we think about this world ahead, you have new business models as well. And so we spend a lot of time trying to think through how these business models are going to be evolving, where the disruption is, how companies can embrace change. They're going to cannibalize themselves or someone else is going to do it for them. So a lot that we're excited about.
Great. Thanks very much, Dan. This sounds like there's a lot to be very excited about. As we wrap up our conversation today, would love you to talk about 3 takeaways that you'd like our listeners to walk away with.
The first one is that a lot of what we're discussing anew is really in the very early innings. If we think about the transformation as one example of the industrial landscape, think about the intelligence on the factory floor in manufacturing plants, the world around us having smarter devices, smarter autonomous systems being able to help improve productivity. It's very, very early, and we would expect to be talking about this 10 years from now and beyond. The second one, the supply chain challenges are real, but I think given the focus and the investment from companies, from governments, really in terms of nurturing an environment where organizations are incented to make thoughtful investments over the longer term, I do think a lot of the problems are going to get solved. It will take time, but there's a lot that's being done globally, which is going to help solve it. And then the final piece around regulation, I think a big part of this is the ability to improve the level of transparency. The issues around data, privacy, security, they're incredibly important. And of course, we all realize that different societies think about them in different ways. And so what I think the companies can do more of is to engage with governments, with regulators, with other bodies to help think through what are the ways to educate users and ensure that people appreciate how data is being used, how things can remain competitive and still deliver valuable products and services to people.
That's terrific, Dan. I think that's a good place to end today's comments. But I can't let you go before I ask a quick bonus question. So, Dan, as someone who covers technology, I'd love to ask you, what is your favorite app and why?
My favorite app remains YouTube, but it's because of my two daughters who are 3 and 5, or just about 4, as my younger one will tell me, and 5.5, as my older one will tell me, because I can bring up entertainment at a moment's notice. But, and there's always a but, I need to be able to keep an eye on what they're doing. And so YouTube remains my favorite app because of the power of bringing up Peppa Pig or Daniel Tiger within a nanosecond anew. So that is the most important app.
It's very true. I was going to say mine is probably Disney Plus for the exact same reasons. Dan, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode. Really appreciate your thoughts here. There's a number of issues that impact all of us, and I think you've highlighted some of the key concerns and, really helped to hear some of the innovations that you've highlighted. We'll have to check back in a few months or another year or so to see how some of those play out. But again, Dan, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Anu. Delighted to be with you.
And with that, we will conclude our 3-part series on supply chains here on Disruptive Forces. Encourage you to go back and listen to the previous episodes if you haven't already done so. And as always, if you've enjoyed this episode of Disruptive Forces, I encourage you to subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, or you can visit our website, www.nb.com/disruptive forces, where you can find previous episodes and more about our firm and offerings.
This podcast contains general market commentary, general investment education, and general information about Neuberger Berman. It is for informational purposes only, and nothing herein constitutes investment, legal, accounting, or tax advice, or a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold a security. This communication is not directed at any investor or category of investors, and should not be regarded as investment advice or a suggestion to engage in or refrain from any investment-related course of action. All information is current as of the date of recording, and is subject to change without notice. Any views or opinions expressed may not reflect those of the firm as a whole. This material may include estimates, outlooks, projections, and other forward-looking statements. Due to a variety of factors, actual events or market behavior may differ significantly from any views expressed. Please refer to the disclosures contained in the episode notes and episode details, which are an important part of this communication. Investing entails risks, including the possible loss of principal. Past performance is no guarantee of future results.